In this video, I'm going to be trying a different method of rejuvenating solder tips. This is what a brand new Hakko solder tip looks like. You can see where the chromium layer ends and the solder layer begins. That solder layer is covering an iron layer. In the past 2 decades, I've accumulated 8 used solder tips. I used them to solder over 400 PC boards and countless cables and connectors. Each tip lasts several years, but they end up looking pretty ratty. The first 4 here are particularly bad. I'm not quite sure why I keep them around, since it costs me less than $1 per year to buy new ones. We're coming up to the ones that aren't in too bad of a shape. On this one you can clearly see how the chromium turns blue when it gets hot. The finer tipped ones coming up are in a little better shape because they're not used that much. The reason they're not used much is that you can't get a lot of heat flowing through a tiny tip, especially when you have a long thin tip like this and this one. I don't take particularly good care of my tips. I just use a wet sponge for cleaning, and I don't leave the iron on if I'm not actively soldering all day. I do find it strange that the tips in the labs at work are always totally useless. I've seen a lot of methods to clean up cruddy tips, but I'm going to see if I can just scrape them down to the iron and tin them with solder. Starting with this tip, which clearly has areas where the solder won't stick. This side is totally corroded. First, I'm going to put it in a vise and operate on it cold. Here it is in a vise. I've zoomed in a bit and I'm just going to scrape it lightly with this very sharp knife. I'm just sort of getting a feel for what this knife does to the material on the tip. After some light scraping and zooming in a little bit more, it's pretty clear that the knife can take off most of this crud. I'm going to spend a little bit more time gently scraping this tip and then fire up the iron and see if it'll take some solder. Okay, it's heating up now, and we'll see what happens when we introduce some solder. It's been cooking for a while as I went to turn on my fume extractor. It seems to be taking solder okay, certainly a whole lot better than when I started. Here I'm just playing around with the hot iron and the knife to see if it's easier to scrape when it's hot. It would be easier if I had a rotary clamp that I could clamp it and rotate while I'm working on it. But it works okay. Next I'm going to try a really ugly one. This tip is very old and it looks very corroded. But the corrosion looks like it's a surprisingly thin layer. I'm going to skip sections where it's kind of boring and not much is happening. But you can see this stuff is coming off and it's looking pretty smooth. This tip actually seems to have come a long way back. Now let's see how it responds to solder. Well, it's finally getting hot enough to melt solder, and it's sticking pretty good. Here are the two tips that I worked on. I didn't get very aggressive with the scraping, but they still improved a lot from start to finish. I'm not sure this method is all that great, but it might be a good first step in polishing up cruddy old tips. One thing that it does highlight is that these nasty old tips may still have some life in them yet. As far as the digital microscope goes, it creates very nice pictures and video. It won't always be the best tool to get the job done, but it's pretty good for blogging.